Hi, the last time we were here we talked about Broadway History Part 1, which was the history of the musical theater that we really talked about from 1927 to 1930. Let's talk about where the 30s left us. It's really kind of an interesting era, the 30s, because certainly it was the Depression and people really didn't have money. But the entertainment that there was evolving through both the musical theater comedy and then certainly the Hollywood issues that anybody that could sing or anybody that could dance, Hollywood was snatching up to also put into musicals. So Broadway was a major feeding piece from Broadway into the movies. First of all, we had George Gershwin, who died in 1937, and he and his brother Ira had already written Porgy and Bess. It was considered a landmark at the time. Not everybody really loved it. But it was certainly very, very advanced for the time. People didn't know whether it was an opera. People didn't know whether it was a musical. And Ira was living alone in Los Angeles, and he was really doing what he could to survive the death of his brother, which was a real terrible loss for him. Then we have Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart, Irving Berlin, and Harold Arlen, who really at this point in time were taking over the Broadway composer dominance that was going on in the period. And other than Porgy and Bess, which was really very heavy subject matter, the only other musicals that really were prominent at the time were really very fluffy. They were full of tap dancers. The dancing was really part of an entertainment. It was boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl, and those were the stories of the time. The songs were often written, plopped into the musicals. They could have been plopped into anything, and they weren't really relevant to what the story was about. It was just great songs put into a story. They didn't really connect. One didn't service the other, and so forth. Then the evolution started in about 1940. The first 2 years of the 40s really were still filled with nonsensical shows in the styles of the 30s. There were two that stood out, which we'll talk about in a minute, but by and large, the same kind of thing that had been going on in the 30s was going on. Cole Porter wrote two vehicles for Ethel Merman. One was called Panama Hattie. Very deep plot. She owned a bar in Panama, and she fell in love with somebody, and she might not be good enough for his family. That was the plot. And then, of course, Cole Porter wrote DeBerry Was a Lady. This was another great plot. An actress and her friend are backstage reading. He gets hit on the head. He has a dream that he's living in the period of his book, which I think was A Tale of Two Cities, and they're back with the French, with French royalty prior to the Revolution. Real deep plot there also. And then Rodgers and Hart did have a breakthrough. They wrote Pal Joey, which is interesting, and we'll talk about in a minute, but then they retreated back with another musical, their last together, called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. The stars at the time, first of all, Ethel Merman, certainly everybody knows who she was. We'll talk about her in a minute too. We had Ethel Waters, who was a black performer, which was very, very significant at the time. Black and white actors didn't usually interact in the same musicals unless, of course, the black people were playing menial roles. And Ethel Waters was a jazz singer from the 20s. She got her start at the Cotton Club, and she was on Broadway in this period. You had Bert Lahr, who we all know was in The Wizard of Oz. Mary Martin was discovered in this period. Gertrude Lawrence, who was an English actress who was well known for her relationships with Noel Coward. You had Vivian Siegel, who was really the diva of the day. She was in every major musical from about 1920 on. If she wasn't in it, people almost didn't go. Then Gene Kelly was discovered in this era. He played Joey in Pal Joey. We'll talk about that. The only Broadway musical he did because Hollywood discovered him next. Alfred Drake, who took the lead role of Curly in Oklahoma. He was a relatively unknown singer at the time. John Raitt was discovered, who did the road tour of Oklahoma and did so well with it that Rodgers and Hammerstein cast him, obviously, as Billy Bigelow in Carousel. And then Pearl Bailey, also another black actress, a jazz singer at the time, who made her mark on Broadway. And then Eve Arden did a couple of Broadway shows, Best Foot Forward and a couple of others. And of course, she went on to be very famous as our Miss Brooks. And Celeste Holm got her start as Adu Annie in Oklahoma, and she went on to very serious acting roles in Hollywood and won an Academy Award in the 1940s for Gentleman's Agreement. So here was Ethel Merman. It's hard to believe how beautiful she was, and we know what the voice was. And The program on the right is actually from Panama Hattie. That's the get-up she had toward the end there. And you have Eddie Cantor and Ethel Merman, and this was Ethel Merman also in one of her other musicals. Mary Martin on the left, she broke through singing My Heart Belongs to Daddy, sitting on a piano, singing the Cole Porter tune, being very sexy. Did a Kurt Weill musical, One Touch of Venus, and Ethel Waters in the middle, and Vivian Siegel on the right. This is Vivian Siegel from the Pal Joey era. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The composer group of the 40s, there were some significant new composers who broke out in the 40s, and this were really kind of interesting. First of all, we had Kurt Weill. Kurt Weill was a German refugee. He left the Nazi Germany in about 1932-33. He was accused of being a communist because of his play, The Threepenny Opera, that he wrote with Bertolt Brecht. He knew he was going to be in trouble if he stayed because of the rise of the Nazis, and he and his wife, Lotte Lenya, escaped to Paris, then came to the United States. During the 40s, he wrote Lady in the Dark, which was certainly a milestone event. We'll talk about that. He wrote One Touch of Venus, which was a Mary Martin star vehicle. Street Scene. Okay, so then we had Rodgers and Hammerstein, who created 4 major musicals in the 40s. Oklahoma, Carousel, which was a very important piece, Allegro, which a lot of people have never heard of. It was their first flop. And of course, they ended the 40s with South Pacific. And each and every one of these was a very significant part of musical theater development that occurred in the 40s. Then we have Burton Lane, who wrote Finian's Rainbow. It's rarely done today. It was revived last year on Broadway. It has a phenomenal score, a complicated plot, and it's very difficult to perform in today's socially correct world. And Leonard Bernstein wrote his first musical, On the Town, which was a significant piece also. Irving Berlin wrote his biggest hit in 1946, which was Annie Get Your Gun. But he also wrote a review based upon the USO needs of the time called This Is the Army, which was a significant contribution of his. And then Cole Porter also wrote the biggest hit of his career, Kiss Me Kate, which was sort of the second Shakespearean play that became a musical. Boys from Syracuse was based on one written by Rodgers and Hart in the mid-30s. So let's talk about the first changes of the 40s. And it's kind of significant to watch how this evolved. First of all, this is Gertrude Lawrence from Lady in the Dark. And it was a very interesting thing that Kurt Weill created. This was a career woman who really was having a very difficult time making up her mind which of 3 different guys she was going to go spend the rest of her life with. There's some nasty connotations to what her angst was, who was she going to go to bed with. But the interesting thing was she was in psychoanalysis, and she would be talking to her psychiatrist about the dreams that she had. And when these dreams became live is where all of the music was written. And it was a 3-act play, later filmed into a movie with Ginger Rogers, by the way. And sex was an underlying theme of all of it. And each act had these enormous dreams with musical numbers. And this is where Danny Kaye was introduced to musical theater on Broadway at the time. And it was really very advanced for its time. First of all, they contained the music into 3 different segments. So they're very, very different kinds of music for each one of the acts. One of the songs was actually, they were pastiche kinds of songs that Stephen Sondheim actually used the style of later on when he wrote Follies. There's a piece from Lady in the Dark. It's almost a wonderful example of how he later mimicked that style. The score was varied, it was well received, and it ran for over 2 years, which was the first musical in the history of Broadway that actually ran for that period of time. We take that for granted today. Things run for a very long time. But in this era, that just wasn't the case. Carousel, skipping, since we've talked about all of these other musicals up to now, Carousel really was a major change at the time. He had a truly unlikable hero. It was a deep story involving the death of characters, the redemption that this character had, ending with a lot of tears. It's a great story. And it was based upon a Hungarian play called Lilium. They removed it, relocated it to Maine, and for the first time ever they integrated song and dialogue. And the song If I Loved You is really very famous in terms of how they did that. When we hear it now, we hear it recorded all as one. But actually, it took place over a 12-minute scene where there was dialogue in between much of the song. And the introduction was a piece, and then there was dialogue. Then there was more introduction and more dialogue. and the music just continued to be interacted with the song and the music. Let me give you a little taste of what the song sounded like, because today the way we hear it isn't exactly the way it's done in the play. If I loved you, time and again I would try to say all I'd want you to know. If I loved you, words wouldn't come in an easy way. Round in circles I'd go, longing to tell you, but afraid and shy. I'd let my golden chances pass me